St. Thomas Aquinas is one of the most important figures in a movement in intellectual history that is called scholasticism. What does scholasticism mean? What are its aims? There's a definition in the textbook, but I'm going to go a little beyond the definition. It literally means something like, to what? Sort of like the valuing of learning for learning's sake. Now, the larger aim of the scholastic movement, though, was actually to reconcile what two things? It undertook the project of one of the main pieces of St. Thomas Aquinas' scholastic project was to attempt to the best of his ability to reconcile his Christian faith with reason. What philosopher ended up giving him a set of tools for doing so? Which philosopher who we've discussed already gave him some tools in this kit bag? Yes? Aristotle. Now recall we previously said that in the works of St. Thomas Aquinas, he frequently references Aristotle, and he refers to him as the philosopher. Now, if that's not a complimentary moniker, I don't know what is, because there were a lot of philosophers, and to be called the philosopher, that is a mega compliment. Now, what Aquinas found was that there was much in the work of this pagan scholar, Aristotle. Much of Aristotle not only was consistent, not only was much in Aristotle potentially consistent with his Christian views, but it could be used the idea was that he could use Aristotelian reasoning in order to support or back up the rationality of faith. Now keep this in mind, and you'll see this near the end of the chapter. St. Thomas Aquinas understood that in the grand scheme of things, if you're only believing due to logical arguments, that you have quite missed the point. Because central to the Christian tradition is what is called justification by faith. As the earlier Christian philosopher St. Augustine put it, it is the belief that our reason can give us all of the answers. And it is the belief that we could perfect ourselves through rationality that is actually a fatal sin. And that sin is what? It's perhaps the most fatal of all the sins.
Hubris?
Yeah, hubris. Excessive pride, vanity. Because it is the human condition, according to St. Paul, St. Augustine, who was a main interpreter of some of those ideas, that the human condition is inherently fallen. We are by nature sinners. We could never earn salvation. We could never truly understand. Yes?
That sounds a little Hobbesian.
It's very Christian. As a matter of fact, it's this. It is all consistent with the Augustinian doctrine of original sin. We are sinners by nature. This doesn't mean that we can't do good things. This doesn't mean that we cannot be good stewards and so forth. But what it does mean is that if you really think you could ever deserve salvation, you have already shown your sinfulness. And that's because of your vanity, your excessive pride. Yes?
Can I ask a question off topic?
Yes.
Why are your nails black?
Oh, it's a gag. Yeah. You know, me and my, I don't know. Well, me and one of my daughter's favorite performing artists. He's been known for, yeah, the black nails and so forth. But anyway, yeah, I saw my daughter this weekend. Long story, but anyway, I'll behave myself here. But yeah, the understanding is we are fallen by nature. And by the way, rationality can only get us so far. However, St. Thomas Aquinas also knew this, that for many people, faith is not an easy thing to have. I will admit, I am one of those kind of people. This is why he believed that if he could show that faith and reason were consistent on many points, that he might be able to give people who have doubts that additional rational nudge in the direction of faith. This is why he will argue that if the only reason why you believe in these things is because of logical arguments, then you have rather missed the point. If reason can help lead you to faith, well, that's good, but you should not be believing on the basis of reason alone. As a matter of fact, if you take reason far enough, you know what it will do with your faith? It will actually lead you in the direction of skeptical doubts if you take it too far. Now, among the first pieces of rational argumentation that we're going to discuss, and I may have to come back to some of these later on, but one of the first questions that was paramount to Aquinas was to give a consistent argument and convincing argument for what? That God exists. Why arguments for the existence of God? And particularly, why arguments for the existence of God if the basis of your religion is faith? Why would you want to construct arguments for the existence of God? And by the way, I prefer not to call them this. I prefer not to call them proofs, because calling them proofs would also not be in the spirit of Aquinas either. Because he understood that these were not proofs. He understood that if you took each of these 5 ways individually, that they could be broken down and skeptically critiqued. But what he believed is that if you took all 5 of them together and thought of them as a consistent package, that they constituted a strong argument in the direction of belief in the Christian God. A strong argument and proof are 2 different things. You can only have proofs of mathematically and deductive logic type things. So he knew that this was not a proof in that sense. But what he believed, that the 5 ways were a set of 5 arguments that when taken together, they constituted a strong argument for religious belief. And by the way, he also took the viewpoint that as you moved along, each of the 5 ways added an additional layer to the argument. Now I'm going to talk about the first 2 ways together, because in a way they are parallel arguments, even though they have subtle differences. His argument from motion and his argument from cause/causality. And by the way, folks, the second way is the one that is most often associated with this other name. The second way is almost always associated with what philosophers have called the cosmological argument. even though the strongest version you could concoct of the cosmological argument is actually a combination of ways 1, 2, and 3. The version of the cosmological argument I would give actually would incorporate ways 1 through 3 together. Now, the argument for motion runs something like this, and it runs parallel to some observations from physics that most of us take for granted. If something is at rest, it will remain at rest unless what? Unless something imparts motion to it. Now, suppose that at one point, everything that is were at rest. What would it be now? It would be at rest now. But the fact is, there are things that are in motion. And if things that were at rest are now in motion, then there must have been what? Some first mover must have imparted motion on it. Now, if you rip these arguments apart from one another, you'll notice that this first argument, even if it is a logically coherent argument, it only proves that there was a first mover. It doesn't prove that the first mover was God, let alone the Christian God. In other words, there's nothing in this argument about the first mover being perfect. There's nothing about the first mover being a being. There's also nothing about the first believer having incarnated himself at one point in world history and become a man and given himself up as a sacrificial lamb for the sins of the world. In other words, there is none of that in this argument. So even if you accept the argument for motion, it still wouldn't prove, it still would not prove all of the other elements of Christianity anyway. Now, the second way is sometimes called the cosmological argument. It argues for a what? Similarly to the first argument, it argues for the necessity of a first cause. This argument appeals to a very important Aristotelian concept. It appeals to the Aristotelian notion of things having an efficient cause. Remember, the efficient cause of anything is the one thing that was absolutely necessary to have brought about another state of affairs. My efficient cause was my mom and my dad having gotten it together. Each of them had their efficient cause, their moms and their dads getting it together. Their moms and their dads getting it together. Now, this is where the argument goes. The cosmological argument says we could trace this series of efficient causes back and back and back. However, at one point, there had to be a what? However, there must at some point have been a beginning. The second way rejects the possibility of what? It rejects the possibility of an infinite series of causes. Any guess why it rejects the possibility of an infinite series of causes? The answer is simple, but perhaps not obvious. It rejects the possibility of an infinite series of causes. Think about what your brain can comprehend. This is my hint. Most of you have probably heard of this peculiar irrational number. Infinity. We can talk about infinity, but you will never what? you will never understand or be able to get your head around the concept of infinity. This is why Aquinas and Aristotle will argue that the concept of a universe that has no beginning and no end is absurd. Therefore, at one point in time, there must have been a first cause. And according to St. Thomas Aquinas, the only being that would be up to that task would be the first cause, God. Now, I want to give you a little bit of critique here. And this goes a little bit beyond the textbook. You guys have all heard of Bertrand Russell before. He was referenced in the very beginnings of the course. In a very famous debate between Bertrand Russell and Father Frederick Copleston, debating the existence of God, Copleston uses a version of the cosmological argument. And Russell asks a pithy version of a critique that's fairly obvious. If you just said an infinitely existing universe is impossible, why is it that it makes sense to you that there is a being that has always existed? In other words, by your reasoning saying that infinity is absurd, you just said an infinitely existing being, God, does make sense. You just contradicted yourself. And he would say, as a matter of fact, a perfectly reasonable question to ask would be, if everything has a cause, but what caused God? If, according to your principle, every last thing must have an efficient cause, then God must also have a cause. How is it that God isn't also an absurd concept? I'm going to go outside the textbook a little bit more before I move on. I can send you an interesting short little piece about this. How many of you have heard of this concept called the God of the gaps? Once I explain it, I imagine some of you have heard it before. Now, notice that in very, very early times, many things that used to be explained, many things that are now explained scientifically, used to be explained superstitiously. We would appeal to the gods and divine wrath to explain earthquakes and things of this nature. Today, we would talk about it in terms of plate tectonics. What the God of the gaps critique says is this. What people do is they call upon God as an explanation to fill in the gaps in our understanding. When in fact, appealing to the concept of God to fill in the holes in our understanding actually explains what? Nothing. Does anyone know why God doesn't really explain anything? I'll give you two reasons. Oh, Mr. Toberman.
It's because it's like very abstract in nature.
Yeah. I'm going to say something similar. Whenever we're looking for scientific explanations, we are looking for natural things that we can verify, that we can vidi with our senses and so forth. When we appeal to God as an explanation, we are appealing to the supernatural. And I have a pithy little remark about supernatural explanations. Every supernatural explanation is just as reasonable as any other supernatural explanation. Because guess what supernatural explanations don't appeal to? Anything that can be observed, nor anything that can be disproven in principle. In other words, any supernatural explanation that you can make up is just as reasonable as somebody else's supernatural explanation. It's just that we tend to believe what about our own supernatural explanations?
That they're correct and everyone else's is false.
Yeah, they make sense because they're ours. But yet the other guy's religion is just stupid. When, as the philosopher William James would put it, if you had been brought up in that other person's religion, that other person's religion would be just as reasonable to you as your current religion is now. And this is because you were trained to have the mindset of that religion. And by the way, there is a rather sarcastic organization that critiques these kind of supernatural appeals by cooking up their own religion. How many of you have heard of our good friends the Pastafarians, also known as the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster? And in the beginning there was the meatball. I'm just making stuff up here, but this Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster is real. They would like to see religion completely taken out of public discourse. That's part of their mission. They don't believe any religion should be tax exempt. Because in fact, religious organizations are really what? No matter how you cut it. They're businesses. And oftentimes they are in the business of driving their politics down their secular throats. Driving their politics down their secular throats. Supernatural explanations don't have any real empirical backing behind them. And the fact is, explaining in terms of Thor smacking his hammer on the canopy of clouds is just as reasonable as, well, God got pissed off, so he's yelling right now. The biggest beef that a critic would have of supernatural appeals in general is that rather than looking for naturalistic explanations, instead it goes backwards scientifically and says, I'm going to look for some kind of supernatural religious explanation to explain things. The scientific worldview would say, all these arguments fail to even consider potential naturalistic arguments. And more than one of you mentioned this in your homework. This particular argument would be explained naturalistically by some version of what used to be called the Big Bang. The Big Bang would say something like, in the beginning, there was matter. And by the way, matter is kind of what?
God.
Well, I won't say it's God. Matter has always existed in some way or another. Of course, we can never say what. We can never say why. But the person with the naturalistic explanations would say what? Simply because we can't know why doesn't give us a rationale for saying, well, therefore God. Because to say therefore God is basically to leap to a conclusion that's not only not scientific, but also something that we could not prove nor disprove. And the ability not to be able to disprove something is not the virtue of a good theory. Go ahead.
Well, wouldn't that be the same thing as religion in general?
No, because at least naturalistic accounts look for physical natural causes that we can actually observe and we can try to come to better understanding. Very few of you answered that question about the difference between theological explanations and scientific explanations. Scientific explanations try to look for discernible causes that can be observed and explained. And the ultimate hope of scientific accounts is not to have to appeal to things that we can't provide explanatory accounts for. Now, I want you to know another word. I mentioned it more than once in here. I think I may have mentioned it once before. I mention it at one point or another in almost all of my courses. How many of you have heard of the principle of parsimony? I mentioned this before. Yeah, good. Naturalistic accounts are more parsimonious by nature than supernatural accounts. Does anyone know why? Naturalistic accounts don't make any assumptions beyond what is observable. And if in fact we do make conjectures about things naturalistically, guess what we then go out and try to do? We look for supporting reasons. And if our particular naturalistic explanation has holes in it, eventually we might decide to do what? We might decide to kick it to the curb and start all over again. There is not one shred of evidence that you could put forth to the person of faith that would ever do what to him? Change his mind. The person of faith will go on believing no matter what contradictory evidence shows up. And that is the core difference between scientific explanations and theological explanations. And also, naturalistic accounts do look to empirical evidence. Evidence from the senses, data that we can gather and so forth. Now, this is not to say that we have faith that science can get us all the answers. But if we are to have meaningful answers, they will be found by gathering evidence, not by telling stories that may or may not be true.